is that any of the I think, are we good here in terms of that string of the Venetian blind behind them?
Yeah, so it's not, it's off, and we're rolling.
Okay, good. We're rolling.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Taylor, thank you very much for doing this interview. Just to kind of get a background a little bit, can you talk about where you grew up, politics in your family, early influences on you?
I grew up in a small town just east of Worcester, Massachusetts. It was an all-white town. My father was a teacher, a professor at Worcester State College. My mother was worked in the home and also was a librarian from time to time. I had a brother, have a younger brother and an older sister. And my sister grew up in the early stages of the anti-Vietnam War period while I was in high school. During that time, I was very much a straight arrow kid, jock, student, president of the student council, all the kinds of things that a good young boy does. Most likely to succeed in my high school. Went away to an Ivy League school in Providence, Rhode Island. And thanks to my sister and the times, I started to become slowly liberalized and then radicalized. And I came to Chicago in 1968, and that's when the process of being radicalized really began for me.
Okay, good. I'm gonna just try to get that little cable a little bit, just stay like you are. I'm just gonna mess with this a little bit. Okay.
And straighten the tile.
This way?
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Well, talk about how you decided to become a lawyer.
Well, I wish there was some kind of intentional decision on my part, but really what happened was I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do when I came out of college. I had heard, I sort of vaguely wanted to be a politician, then I'd heard you had to be a lawyer to be a politician, so I applied to law school and I ended up at Northwestern Law School in Chicago. And that's when I fell in with some really remarkable young lawyers and law students, and that took me on my journey into being a people's lawyer.
Okay, so 68 in Chicago?
Yes.
Were you there during the convention and all that?
I got to Chicago the week after the convention. My parents and I and my family are watching the convention on TV, and then I'm headed there. And it didn't have a direct effect on me until the next year. And that's when I started to work with the young lawyers and law students, not on the conspiracy trial, which of course arose from the Democratic National Convention, but started to work defending Black Panthers, young lords, SDS Weathermen. There was another group, an Appalachian group called the Young Patriots, Rising Up Angry, which was another group of young white radicals. And we were representing all these folks. And these lawyers were working out of legal aid offices, and the legal aid offices said, you can't do that. So finally, they basically kicked the lawyers and us who were working with them out. And we had to start, and we started the People's Law Office.
So the People's Law Office, what year were we talking about for that start?
We're talking about 1969. In fact, in August of this year will be our 50th anniversary of the People's Law Office in Chicago. That's when we actually physically started the office. We found an old sausage shop and then converted it on the near north side of Chicago. At that time, it was very much a working class and diverse neighborhood, and we hung up our People's Law Office shingle, built a little cubicles for every lawyer to be in and law students, and that's where we practiced out of.
Okay, well, so you mentioned some of the early cases that you worked on. Can you go into a little bit more, like?
Sure. We we're at that particular point in history, of course, it was a remarkable time. There was a tremendous resistance to the war in Vietnam. The Black Panthers in Chicago were becoming very strong. They were forming a rainbow coalition with the other groups that I just mentioned, the Young Patriots, the Young Lords, and SDS, and forming a very strong coalition of radical and revolutionary organizations. And of course, in response, the local police and the prosecutors were arresting them for everything from standing on street corners selling the Black Panther Party newspaper to shootouts between the police and the Panthers when the police would attack their offices on the west side of Chicago. So we were doing all that kind of representation, and as we represented all these folks, we came to really respect the work that they did. We came to respect their leadership, and particularly we came to respect a charismatic young black leader by the name of Fred Hampton. And he was someone that we represented in various cases that he was put into during that period of time in 1969.
Well, so that brings us to that case of, as you call it, the shoot-in. I was looking at some of the stuff with Amy Goodman, innocent. But talk about what happened there, that whole infamous incident.
Well, Fred Hampton and several other young Panthers were staying in an apartment on the west side of Chicago, a very small apartment. And they had guns there for self-defense because, of course, one of the platforms of the Black Panther Party was defending the community, self-defense against the police, along with many other programs that they had, the breakfast program, the newspaper, health clinics, a lot of things that now are accepted as social programs the Panthers started back in the day. And this, of course, made them real targets of the police. And so early morning of December 4th, 1969, a cadre of Chicago police officers working under the direction of the state's attorney or head DA of Cook County, that being the county that Chicago is in, went to the apartment where these Panthers were sleeping. And they burst into the front and the back. And they fired over 90 bullets from machine guns, shotguns, handguns into the apartment. And Fred Hampton lay dead in the back bedroom. Another Panther who was a leader from Peoria, Illinois, Mark Clark, lay dead at the front door. He was sitting sentry. And many of the Panthers all of the Panthers were either wounded who survived or were arrested allegedly for attempted murder on the police.
So from that point, that was 1969?
That was.
And so can you trace what happened? I know it was 13 years or something before you were able to get some justice for the...
Well, we got calls from the Panthers because we represented them to come to the apartment where the shooting took place, and also go to the jail where the Panthers were being held, who were alive and not in the hospital. So I happened, as a law student, to go to the apartment. And the apartment, the police left open. You normally see the yellow tape around a crime scene. The police didn't do that. We speculated later it was either because they were afraid it was becoming dawn, it was pre-dawn raid, that they were afraid there'd be an uprising in the community if they stayed there against them. The other explanation, and it could be both at the same time, was that they just were so arrogant. They were pretty convinced that they were going to get away with it. And if they hadn't left it open, they might well have, because the state's attorney, Ed Hanrahan, held this big press conference, laid out on the table all the guns that were seized in the apartment, talked about how it was a major shootout, that the Panthers and the police engaged in this major shootout, and the vicious Black Panthers, I think his words were, but for the grace of God, the police would have been killed. Well, as soon as we got to the apartment, And after we got over the shock of seeing the blood on the floor where Fred Hampton had been murdered and his body had been dragged, and seeing all the bullet holes in the walls, this is a very, plasterboard walls, very tiny little bedrooms, and the machine gun bullets had ripped through all of the walls of the apartment. We realized that they were lying, that it was just nothing but a bold-faced lie that Hanrahan and the police were telling. And the Panthers understood that as well. And so while we were taking evidence, documenting by film and by pictures and by just taking and writing down where every bullet that and every bullet hole and lining up all the bullet holes, the Panthers were taking people from the community on tours through the apartment. And in those tours, they would be pointing out this, and they, every morning, they would take the bed on which Fred Hampton was murdered and was soaked in blood. They would bring it from where it was hidden at night and brought back to where it was in the apartment. And so when they went through showing all the bullet holes and pointing out the deal, they'd also show this is the bed on the chairman, where the chairman was murdered. And thousands of people went through this apartment like for 2 weeks. And here we were taking the evidence during that time. And of course it was a life-changing series of events for me and all the people that worked at the People's Law Office, knowing Fred Hampton, knowing the Panthers, knowing what they stood for, and coming to the realization of, wow, this is what the police will do. This is the extent that the police will go to when they're challenged, when there's a revolutionary group that's challenging the power structure, and when they want to, they meaning the power structure, want to make political gain out of. In fact, the state's attorney thought that this would be a major feather in his cap to have arrested the Panthers and to have killed these vicious Black Panthers, that this was his war on gangs, as he called it. And many things stood out to me as a young law student at that time, but one that really was powerful was an older African-American woman who's going through the apartment, and she's looking at it and she's listening to the Panthers pointing things out. And she looked, and I happened to be around when she said this. She shook her head and said, "Ain't nothing but a northern lynching." And this was the impact that being in that apartment, seeing what really happened, had on people, had on us, had on the community. And over a period of time, we were able, because of having the truth right there in the apartment, physically, we were able to change the narrative from a shootout to a shoot-in, and then over this 13-year period, we were able to discover that not only was it a shoot-in, but it was a murder, that Fred Hampton was shot twice in the head while he lay asleep, perhaps drugged by an informant in the back bedroom. And as we went on, we were able to uncover the fact that it was not just a raid by some crazed police officers with a machine gun. Not only was it just a raid orchestrated by the head DA of Cook County, but it came straight from Washington, it came from the FBI, it came from the Cointelpro program, and that they took credit for the actual raid because there was an FBI informant who sketched out the apartment's layout, made a floor plan, gave that floor plan to hit the Cointelpro Racial Matters FBI agent in Chicago, who then passed it on to the DA Hanrahan and to the police, and that they used that as a basis for their raid.
Can you briefly talk a little bit about what Cointel, that program was?
Cointelpro started out when the FBI started. The FBI, there was a young lawyer by the name of J. Edgar Hoover who started the FBI and made his first bones on the Palmer raids back in the late 1919, 1920. And after that kind of attack on the radical left in the United States, the FBI started to actually identify and put forward a plan, an illegal and unconstitutional plan and program called Cointelpro, the counterintelligence program. And it was first designed primarily against socialist and communist organizations, although it also targeted Marcus Garvey and some others in black liberation. As we got past the McCarthy era and got to the civil rights movement, Cointelpro became more violent and more focused on the African American leadership. It focused on Dr. King, it focused on Malcolm X, it focused on Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam, H. Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and their organizations. And Hoover was he wanted everything in writing. And so all these memorandum were called airtels, butels, that kind of thing, were exchanged between the field offices of the FBI and the headquarters. And so they documented this program. And in fact, they were supposed to tell Hoover what they were doing to justify the program. And so as it turned into the 60s and they focused on King, and they wrote these memos, and they talked about trying to neutralize, disrupt the organizations and the leadership to prevent the rise of a messiah who would electrify the black nationalist movement. They wrote all this down. And we and others were ultimately able to get this documentation. And when the Panthers became a force, Hoover went really off the rails in terms of the violence and the unconstitutional conduct that Cointelpro focused on. And that led him and the FBI into orchestrating various raids against Panthers across the country, and led to their actual approach to destroy. The neutralize was kind of a cleansed word that could mean a lot of different things, but it became, with regard to the Panthers, destroy by any means necessary, and that's why the raid was part and parcel and claimed by the FBI to be part of this highly illegal and unconstitutional and very secret at that time Cointelpro program.
Okay, I'm just gonna once again try to get that dang little cable. It says it's not a big deal. I mean, yeah, it's superb.
I'm gonna adjust some levels.
Okay.
Real quick.
So
We're rolling.
Excellent. All right. Well, so the Fred Hampton case ultimately, after 13 years, talk a little bit. So, what was the final resolution of the Fred Hampton? What was the final deal?
Well, my first trial as a lawyer was the Fred Hampton civil rights case, and it was an 18-month trial, longest trial in federal court history at that time. And during that trial, we uncovered a lot of this evidence that connected the FBI to the murder of Fred Hampton. And so as this 13 years went on, the case went, in terms of the narrative, from a shootout, that was the police narrative, to a shoot-in, and then to a murder, and then to a political assassination by the government. And some remarkable things happened during this 13-year period and during this trial as well, not the least of which it was uncovered during the trial that the FBI had suppressed some 200 volumes of FBI documents that they were supposed to produce as part of the discovery in the case. And when they produced that evidence pursuant to a court order, there was some remarkable evidence that had been buried in those files, not the least of which was a document which reflected that after the raid on the Panther apartment, After the fact that Hampton and Clark lay dead, the FBI in Chicago and the Cointelpro program contacted Hoover and his people in Washington and requested a bonus, a financial bonus of $300 for the informant, William O'Neill, who set up the raid. And the justification was that the raid was a success. And that therefore they wanted O'Neill to have his 30 pieces of silver, which in this case was $300. And of course this was a powerful, powerful affirmation of our theory of the case, which was that the FBI was behind the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And unlike the cases of Dr. King and Malcolm X, where there certainly was a lot of documentation that the FBI had the intent of attempting to destroy them as leaders and also destroy their organization, there was no smoking gun that showed the actual connection between the assassination and the FBI. In this case, there was.
Somehow I'm just curious, you'd heard about these files that they had produced, but how'd you even hear about them?
Well, it was a process. Through the discovery process before trial, you ask for documents, and they'd give you some, and then you had the distinct feeling and understanding that they had others, but they would say they didn't have them, or the judge would say that they're not relevant. I'm going to say that you don't need to produce them. But a witness made a misstep in trial, which exposed the fact that there had to be, right in the open, exposed the fact that there had to be many, many additional documents that we hadn't gotten. And the judge, who was definitely someone who was on the side of the government, realized that he needed to at least give the appearance that there was compliance with his orders. And so he said, well, bring up the files. He had no idea that it was going to be 200 volumes of documents that they had suppressed. And these documents showed, just a wide range of activities against the Panthers. But as I said, the last volume that they produced over a month or two period after they redacted all of them was this document, which we call the bonus document.
Okay, just keep rolling. I'm going to just make a little adjustment here, as much as possible. I'm going to move this.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Done that, yeah.
It's not a big deal, but okay. Yeah, move that little cable. Okay, thank you. Okay, this is great stuff. Okay, so. Yeah, I mean, I'm just one quick question. In other words, 200 volumes. I mean, the amount of time, in terms of your law office, the PLO, to go through that amount of material is mind-boggling.
Well, what was more mind-boggling was the judge was instantly very aggravated at us for having the temerity to actually have exposed these documents. We said, we should have a mistrial. We should be able to start over again with all this evidence after we've been able to analyze it and figure out exactly, what it is. He said, no, we're going to continue with the trial. So in the morning, we would get 2 or 3 volumes of the documents because the FBI, after showing the judge they had them, took them all back to delete certain parts of the documents. So we get 2 or 3 volumes every day. And in the morning, we'd be doing a hearing on these documents. In the afternoon, we'd be in front of the jury because the judge would not give us a new trial. So I'm sitting there at counsel table trying to somehow figure out what's in all these documents. And like 2 months later, as we were going through the charade of continuing the trial and doing this hearing, the 199th and 200th volume were given to us, and these were O'Neill, the informant's secret files. And lo and behold, as I looked through these last files, this is where they had kept it. I assume it was intentional. They really were going, we don't want them to have this document, so they put it off to the very, very end. But we did get it in the last volume of documents that they produced during this hearing. But yes, it was on the fly, looking at all these documents, trying to figure out how they fit into the mosaic of our case, they were under protective order, meaning that they weren't public, so the only way we could get them public was to actually introduce them into evidence in front of the jury, so we would pick out the most powerful ones and introduce it in front of the jury, so that then the people, the journalists covering the case could then have them and publicize the documents. So there was a lot going on, to say the least.
Wow, what an amazing story. Well, moving ahead, and this involves our friend Mr. Pitts back here, the Klan shooting in '79. Talk about that whole deal, if you would.
Sure. Well, my office's entry into the case was 3 or 4 years after the actual massacre happened. And Lewis Pitts and folks that he was working with had been dealing with the case before I ever got involved. And they asked me to come and work on the civil rights case that they had brought in federal court. And it was the third in a series of cases that were brought against the Klan and the Nazis. And our case, unlike the other two, which were criminal cases, were also joined in the conspiracy. The police who did not respond to the massacre, and in fact were absent when the Klan and Nazis paraded as in a caravan into Greensboro to the demonstration where the anti-Klan demonstrators were. And ours was a civil case rather than a criminal case. And unbelievably almost, the criminal cases that had proceeded with all-white juries had acquitted the Klan and acquitted the Nazis of murder and other criminal offenses, despite the fact that the murders were on videotape. And it was just a complete scandal into and of itself that these Klansmen and Nazis who had committed murder on videotape had walked free, thanks to all-white Southern juries. And so Lewis asked me and the People's Law Office to come down and assist them as co-counsel in the civil case to at least try to get some justice in terms of what had happened here, and to try to put forward a narrative that not only talked about the viciousness and the murderous activities of the Klan and Nazis, but to link that to the Greensboro police and to the FBI, who'd also turned their backs and had an informant in the Klan, and the ATF, which had an informant in the Nazis and had been involved in planning this massacre. So that was the scope of the case that Lewis and other lawyers and law students and of course the widows of the men and women who had been murdered by the Klan and presented in 1985 in Winston-Salem in a federal court.
And what was the resolution of that case?
Well, that case had one African-American juror and one woman who was from Connecticut originally. And we presented a very strong case of conspiracy, and it went on for, I believe, 3 months. And after the case rested, the jury went out and it couldn't come to a conclusion. There was a real conflict in the jury between the 4 Southern white jurors and the African-American man and the woman who was transplanted from Connecticut. And at first the case was going to be hung and mistried, but the judge urged them to continue to deliberate, and they came up with a compromise verdict. The two that supported us accepted our theory of the case, in essence, that the FBI and the police and all of the Klans and Nazis were responsible in a conspiracy. That the four Southern folks didn't want to, wanted a verdict for the Klan and Nazis and everybody. So they forged a compromise verdict, but nonetheless a verdict that was, I think, historic in the South, which actually did recognize a conspiracy between several of the Greensboro police and some of the Klan and Nazis. It was clearly a compromise, and they only found for one or two of the families of the people who were murdered and the survivors who were injured. And they didn't award the kind of money that was commensurate with the injury. But nonetheless, after these other two trials, it was at least a trial where a victory could be claimed, and we did claim the victory because of the fact that, at least symbolically, it recognized how law enforcement agencies operated and continued to operate as late as 1985, and I would hesitate to guess they still do to some degree here in the South, of turning their backs on white supremacists. I mean, we look at Charlottesville and we see a kind of a shadow of Greensboro, or in terms of what happened and how law enforcement reacted to the atrocities in Charlottesville.
Right, right. So ultimately, then there was a financial reparation, or how would you put that in terms of like the Greensboro?
It was a civil case. We certainly weren't prosecutors. We couldn't put them in jail as much as we would like to have. But the jury did bring back a financial award to, I believe, 2 or 3 of the plaintiffs in the case. But it certainly was not commensurate with, as I said, with the damage that was done to the people.
I'm sorry. And Reverend Nelson Johnson, he was there, right? I mean, he was one of the...
He definitely was there, and he was a leader of the CWP, the organization that had organized the demonstration. And fortunately for him, certainly, he avoided being killed. And he took on and continued a leadership role in fighting the cases, along with many of the widows of those who were killed, and has continued to be a leader in this community in Greensboro ever since, and continues to this day.
Okay, well, now moving on, what's our time like? 11:15, we'll keep going. Now let's get into the Andrew Wilson case. Now that was 82, is that correct?
Yes. Andrew Wilson was a man with a first-grade education who, along with his brother, Jackie Wilson, was apprehended after a 5-day manhunt in Chicago of unparalleled viciousness and racism for the killing of 2 white cops on the south side of Chicago. And after Jackie and Andrew were brought to the Southside Detective Station House where they were to be interrogated, they were tortured. And they were tortured with electric shock, with beatings, with suffocation, with a bag over their head. And in Andrew's case, because he was identified as the one who shot the 2 cops, he was handcuffed across a ribbed steam radiator, and electric shocks were applied to him while he was handcuffed across the radiator, so that his chest and face and leg went up against the steam radiator and burned, left 2nd-degree burns on his body. He then gave a confession, his brother gave a confession, and Andrew got the death penalty. Jackie got 2 life sentences. The case went on, and there was so much physical injury on Andrew because of the burns and because of the beatings and the kickings that the Illinois Supreme Court ultimately said that his confession had been physically coerced from him and reversed his criminal case. And it came back to the courts, and he was retried, reconvicted without the confession. And this time he, because one juror held out against the death penalty, he was saved from execution. Well, but while all this was going on, he, in his first grade education, had written out, with the help of a jailhouse lawyer, a lawsuit under the Federal Civil Rights Act, alleging that he'd been tortured by this commander. He was a lieutenant at the time by the name of John Burge. And he talked about all of this torture that I just described and filed it in federal court. And ultimately, we ended up as his lawyers in the civil case in federal court, similar to the civil case in Greensboro and the civil case in the Fred Hampton case. And this lawsuit brought on perhaps two of the most notorious African-American people in the city of Chicago, because they were convicted cop killers, led over the next 30 years to the uncovering of a massive police torture scandal. And we had two very long trials in 1989, not as long as the Fred Hampton trials, during which, through an anonymous police source who wrote me letters exposing certain evidence about this man Burge, the chief torturer, that was a kind of a roadmap for the extent of the systemic nature of the torture. This wasn't just some crazed cops taking out revenge against a cop killer and his brother, as it appeared at first, but rather it was a systemic ring of torturers on the south side of Chicago, led by this man Burge, who selected certain African-American suspects and tortured them into giving false confessions, sending some of them to death row and others to the penitentiary for life based on confessions that oftentimes were false and always tortured from them. And so that case, those cases, the Andrew Wilson civil case, led to the uncovering over the years of over 125 cases, documented cases of police torture, and led to a series of significant victories and struggles in the city of Chicago, where lawyers and activists and others came together to use the evidence that we and others were uncovering in court to establish that this was a systemic program, and that it was a program that was not only orchestrated by a commander in the south side of Chicago, Detective Vaughn, who had all risen to commander, but that it was totally part and parcel part of the judicial system, that the prosecutors were involved, they took the confessions, they presented the confessions in court. The head prosecutor was the Richard M. Daley, who went on to be the mayor of the city of Chicago. He knew about the torture and did nothing to stop it. So I've written a book about it, and it's called The Torture Machine. And the torture,
show it to us?
Sure. The Torture Machine not only was this black box that is depicted on the cover, but which was the black box that had a generator in it that generated electricity, that with the wires that were attached to it in the clips you could give shocks. and that's what was used on Andrew Wilson and others. But the torture machine also reflects the fact that the Daley machine, the Democratic machine of the city of Chicago, was deeply involved in the scandal and its cover-up.
It's kind of remarkable that then he went on to become mayor, Richard Daley.
Yes, well, his father was mayor.
Right.
His father, Richard J. Daley, was mayor for 20 years and was the mayor during the 1968 Democratic Convention, which was later described by the Kerner Commission as being a police riot, which everybody saw on TV for 3 or 4 days in 1968. And so he had this very powerful Democratic machine, and he handed it off in the late 80s, or his successors handed it off after an interlude where we had a progressive black mayor named Harold Washington, to the son. And so Richard M. Daley was mayor of the city of Chicago for 20 years, from 1989 to 2011, actually 22 years. So between the two Daleys, we had a Daley and the machine in explicit power for almost 50 years in the city of Chicago.
It's kind of curious, the old Democratic Party were part and parcel of this whole thing. I mean,
definitely, and the politicians, the judges, of course, particularly the state court judges, the local judges were, most of them, former prosecutors. Many of them were in on the torture itself, if not in on the torture in terms of taking the confessions. They certainly were involved in some manner and had some kind of knowledge. And then they went on to be judges, and they would hear these cases where men would be complaining of being tortured, and of course they deny any motions that they bring to have their confessions thrown out of court. So there was a system that started in the police stations and went through the prosecutor's office all the way through the judiciary that ended up with was a very strong aspect of mass incarceration as it applied to the city of Chicago.
You know, this John Burge, the lieutenant or whatever, the chief torturer, whatever happened to him?
Well, as I mentioned, he started out as a detective. He brought back the torture from Vietnam, where he was on a POW camp as an MP, as a military police sergeant. And he skyrocketed in terms of rank all the way to commander during a 20-year period. During the latter stages of that 20-year period is when we had the trial in the Andrew Wilson case that brought out a lot of the evidence. This forced the city of Chicago's police department to reinvestigate the Andrew Wilson case in terms of the misconduct of the police, and Burge was ultimately fired. He, however, kept his police pension. He moved to Florida and hung out on his boat, which was aptly called the Vigilante. And many, many years later, he was indicted by the federal government in 2008 for obstruction of justice and perjury for lying about torture. He wasn't ever prosecuted for torture because no one, Daley and company, rather than prosecuting him when they could have for torture, they commended him and he was promoted rather than prosecuted. But Burge was ultimately not only fired, but he was prosecuted, did 4 years in federal penitentiary, and just passed away last September. And he's now vilified in Chicago as a notorious torture ringleader. Like with the Panther cases, one of the major things we felt obligated to do and to fight to do as people's lawyers was not only to fight the case in court, but was to bring the truth in terms of the evidence we were uncovering to the public. And in that sense, to change the narrative, to change the narrative that the power structure had attempted to impose in the media, to the people's narrative, to which, you know, and that narrative, like in the Hampton case, was changed in the torture cases from some, you know, crazy cop killers making these wild allegations of torture to the fact that it was a systematic plan of torture, that it wasn't some rogue cops who did it, but it was very much part and parcel of the department, and that the Daley machine was involved in it. So that narrative in Chicago has been changed, similarly to the narrative with regard to the murders of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark.
Did anybody, this is a weird question, anybody ever show any remorse, the cops or anything, for what they did?
No, none of the cops who did the torture have ever shown any remorse. Burge went to his grave denying it and taking the Fifth Amendment in court cases where we would bring him in to testify about it. There were some anonymous cops, as I mentioned, who communicated the truth to us. And then there were some African American cops who worked in the station house under Burge. Burge was smart enough to keep them out of the torture rooms, but they saw the torture box, they heard a lot of the screaming, they heard what one black officer called the scuttlebutt about the torture. It was an open secret in the station house where the torture was taking place. They, because of the police code of silence, never came forward while they were on the job. But after they retired, I was able to go and find some of them, and they were willing to, at that point, because the code of silence wasn't so powerful, because they were no longer subject to it as officers, they told me the things that I just mentioned about it being an open secret and seeing the box and the torture devices.
Well, they must have felt horrible about not doing anything, I guess.
Well, they never really articulated that. There was very early on, there was a black detective who walked in on a torture scene back in the 70s, and Burge was there, and the box was over here, and the man was crying out, and his pants were down, and the black officer said something, and then he went and was taken out of the room, and his, I don't know if it was a lieutenant or a sergeant, said basically, forget about this, you shouldn't have walked into that room, and he was quickly transferred to another assignment. So the message was there. There was a detective who came forward by the name of Frank Laverty and exposed an entire system of illegal street files that were kept by detectives to where they would keep evidence that was favorable to a defendant in a criminal case, and it wouldn't be turned over pursuant to the rules of evidence and discovery. And Laverty was, instead of became a hero in the police department, was ostracized, and he was busted down from being a homicide detective to watching recruits give urine samples at headquarters. So they knew, and in fact, the anonymous cop who communicated to me, who we dubbed Deep Badge, kind of in Watergate, honor of Watergate's deep throat, he kept saying, "I don't want to end up like Laverty." So there was that was a strong message within the Department of the Code of Silence that kept it from being from cops coming forward and publicly stating under oath or otherwise what they knew was going on.
So that's all over now, we hope?
Not completely. There were many victories along the way of this 30, 35-year struggle. Not only was Burge fired and ultimately convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice, but there were reparations that were granted by Chicago City Council and Mayor back in 2015. And these reparations not only included financial compensation to men who survived torture and had not been able to collect anything in the courts, but also created some non-financial reparations, such as a community center, a treatment center for survivors of torture and their families, a full mayoral apology to the men, giving them preferential job training and free tuition to the city colleges, and most significantly, that teaching the torture struggle, the torture history to 8th and 10th graders in the Chicago public schools. So that was a reparations package that an intergenerational and interracial coalition of organizations, together with the lawyers and activists, were able to get accomplished in 2015. But there still are some men that are in prison on the basis of tortured confessions, and there's also supposed to be a memorial to the men, and right now that hasn't been constructed because the city's trying to renege on the financing for that. So the scandal hasn't completely, it's not completely finished, and the fight for justice delayed in the torture cases still goes on.
Wow. Yeah, it's really unbelievable. Now, what was there also something about strip and body cavity searches? Was that a connected case, or?
Well, it's connected in terms of geography. It was in Milwaukee, and there was a Burge-like officer up there who headed up an elite unit in the black community of officers who decided they were going to take solving drug-related crimes into their own hands, literally. And they, thinking that drug dealers kept their drugs in their anus or in their rectum, would stop these men who they targeted as potential dealers on the streets and perform body cavity searches of them, which of course was illegal and unconstitutional. And the leader of this band of white officers, a guy named by the name of Vagnini, was ultimately prosecuted for it and sent to prison. And we did some civil cases up there from men who had been illegally stripped and body cavity searched.
So they do it right there in the street?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Now, what about the case of 11-year-old Ryan Harris?
Okay, Ryan Harris, yeah.
Okay.
Ryan Harris was an 11-year-old young girl in Englewood, a section of Chicago, a poor, predominantly African-American part of the city. And she was brutally raped and murdered. The police didn't really have any suspects, and so they focused on two tiny young boys, one 7 years old and one 8 years old, who were friends of the 11-year-old girl. And this, quote, skilled, unquote, detective who was supposedly expert in questioning little kids, brought these young kids in and interrogated them about the crime. And this was back at the height of the Hillary Clinton talking about the, black youth and demonizing them and dehumanizing them. And so the public, and particularly these detectives, were prone to believe that this 7 and 8 year old kid could have done this. And so they got these kids to make confessions. And the 7-year-old was delayed mentally, so he wasn't even a 7-year-old. But they got him to say, or they wrote down that he said that he had thrown a rock at her and hit her in the head and killed her. And also, she'd been sexually assaulted, and they got him to say that, well, he took a stick and was playing in her vagina with a stick. Well, they locked these kids up in a mental hospital for kids. And lo and behold, not surprisingly, they did DNA tests, took their time doing them, but found sperm in the young girl Ryan Harris's vagina and underpants. And of course, these kids were incapable of ejaculating at that age. And so they were released, but there was always this cloud over these kids' heads. Well, maybe they didn't do it, but they somehow were involved. It turns out when they finally ran the DNA, it matched to a serial rapist and killer. We brought suit for the 7-year-old, and that's how we were involved in the case. And it ruined this young kid's life, obviously, being branded as a killer and rapist before he was even to the age of reason. He, despite a lot of psychological help that we were able to get him, his life was ruined, and he ended up in jail for a long period of time later on. But it was just an outrageous case, an extremely high-profile case in the city, because as you can imagine, when the police are saying that a 7- and 8-year-old committed rape and murder, that's such a sensational thing to say, and it kind of proved this false narrative about predator kids. They're getting younger and younger and younger, and they're doing more and more and more terrible things in the black community primarily. And so it fit that horrendous narrative, which of course was exploded by the DNA testing, but the cops would not give up the ghost of it. And so when we were fighting the civil case, they were still defending the fact that they had taken these confessions, and how were they to know that perhaps it wasn't true, and perhaps the kids were involved as lookouts for the serial rapist, and it was just a disgraceful piece of history in the city of Chicago in terms of police misconduct.
So what was the final?
Well, both of the young kids, by the time they were teenagers, we were able to get, and the lawyers for the 8-year-old were able to get substantial settlements for them. And anybody who looked at with an open mind at the evidence could understand that these kids didn't do it, and that the serial rapist did it. But the serial rapist went to trial, and his defense lawyer was basically pointing the fingers at the kids. So, the cloud over these young kids never lifted. And I have in my office a picture of the mugshot of the 7-year-old kid. It's just remarkable, it's a remarkable case.
Wow. And we'll move towards wrap up here. You've also been involved with prison reform work, like with the Marion Penitentiary?
Yes, particularly back in the early days of the office, we were involved in some prison, taking on the segregation units, first in the federal penitentiary in downstate Marion, Illinois, and later in the what they called the control or SBU units in the state prisons in Illinois, and challenging the fact that they would lock people up without reason because they were characterized as threats, even though they hadn't committed any disciplinary offense. I'm sorry to say that, as much as we were able to in the short term be able to change and get some people out of segregation, that battle is still going on. And you see people in places like Louisiana and California who've been in segregation for 30, 40 years. And there's a very strong movement now, and they've there's a movement to say there shouldn't be segregation at all. But at this point, there's still a lot of long-term administrative segregation in the prisons, state and federal prisons in this country.
So are we talking about solitary confinement?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Wow, what a so over all these years, in terms of, I know money really doesn't repair these horrible damages they've done to people, but you've been able to, your firm has been able to, I was reading, what, $100 million in, or somewhere in there, in terms of the amount of money you've been able to get for the victims of all these horrible things?
Well, we aren't the only lawyers that do this, and we have been able to get substantial judgments and settlements for many of the men and women who have been wrongfully convicted and been tortured. Nowhere near the kind of money that you would expect or think they would do. And of course, the money itself doesn't repair the post-traumatic stress disorder and the other damage that is done to men who are tortured, whether they're innocent or guilty of the crime, that is done by death row, that is done by being in solitary confinement over the years, sensory deprivation, and solitary confinement in maximum security and supermax prisons is a form of torture as well, as defined by the United Nations. But we do what we can in the context of the law and try to take it beyond what the strictures of the courts and work with organizations and activists in their struggles to fight in a broader way the injustices and the racism and the white supremacy that are the subject of our cases, starting in the beginning 50 years ago and right to the present day, in the cases that we're dealing with, including a case right here in Greensboro of hog tying, which we have, and in my book I try to make the linkage between the slave patrols, slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, and torture. All of those are of a piece over history. And the case that I'm talking about here in Greensboro at this point is a hog tying case, which fits right into the concept of torture, fits right into the concept of the slave patrols and hog tying enslaved people, runaways who have escaped and been recaptured, being hog tied after they're captured. The fight against the extreme white supremacy and official racism of police and the entire judicial system continues.
So that's a case that's current,
right?
The hog tying.
Yes, it is.
Well, describe a little bit the PLO. How many lawyers? How big an operation is it? You know, a little bit about.
It's pretty. And the People's Law Office is a small office. Always has been. At this point, we have we have 9 lawyers, 7 partners, and 2 associates, and we have 4 staff members. So we're about 12, 13 people. And we've pretty much been that size or a little smaller ever since we started. It's not been a big operation, but we like to think of that we're the little mouse that roared a little bit.
Well, speaking of all of that, in other words, you also argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Is that true?
True.
Can you talk? You sound like a prosecutor. No, but can you talk about that a little bit? What was that like? I mean,
Well, I've had two cases that I argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and as much as lawyers think of that in terms of kind of an apex in terms of your career to some degree, I'm hopeful not to go back there again, given the makeup of the court, because if we go back there again, in all likelihood, we're going to be defending a case that we've won that the Supreme Court may take away from us. But in the two cases that I argued, they both had to do with the immunities that the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, has since the Warren Court been more and more free with in terms of giving immunities to police and to prosecutors and to judges from suit. And in the first case, which was in 1985, we argued whether prison guards who sat on disciplinary committees that sent prisoners to the to solitary confinement, whether they should have immunity similar to that judges or prosecutors are given. And we argued, of course, no. We had won a case against some prison guards, and the government took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in that case, Justice Brennan and Justice Marshall were still on the court. So it was still had a flavor of the power of the Warren Court. And we won that case. That was quite an experience for me. And then 8 years later, we went back in a case where prosecutors were arguing that they should be immune from suit for cases where, in circumstances where they were involved in doing what could be considered police work. Rather than prosecuting in court, they were either taking a statement from a defendant, or they were working on evidence or doing things like that, not associated with the judicial process per se. And we actually had lost that case, and we went to the Supreme Court and we won. And we established an exception where prosecutors could be sued in circumstances like in the torture cases, where they were doing what could be considered investigative or police type activities rather than prosecutorial activities. That case, Scalia was on the bench at that point, and Thomas had just got on the bench. I ended up jousting with Scalia in that argument, but ultimately we won that case 5-4. So my two journeys to argument in the Supreme Court have been successful, and we've had other cases that have been briefed in the Supreme Court but not argued.
Wow. So you've been doing this for 50 years?
As we sit here now, I would say I've been involved as a student and lawyer with the People's Law Office and the lawyers in the People's Law Office for 50 years.
Remarkable. During all those different cases, like the Fred Hampton and so forth, did they ever try to intimidate you? I mean, certainly pressure. You'd think they would try to say not to. What about that? I mean,
well, it comes in several forms. In the Hampton case, both my partner Jeff Haas and I ended up spending time in federal lockup, being held in contempt. In the torture cases, we were held in contempt, but I never went to jail for it. We received threats, both verbal threats. In the Hampton case, the cops, the shooters, would come to court a lot, and they'd make threats at us and threats to Fred Hampton's brother and all of that. We would receive threats in the torture cases, including it was communicated to us that Burge said he would blow us away if he were convicted of anything. None of these ever came to any kind of fruition. Here in Greensboro, it was really right in our face because the Klansmen and Nazis still lived in the area, and some of them were still leaders in the Klan and Nazis. We were putting them on the stand, and we were targets, and we all lived together in a house in Winston, or most of us did. And we physically were very worried, particularly if the jury came back with a favorable verdict, that we were going to be attacked by the Klan. And we took some precautions in terms of security during that case as well.
Well, I'm just curious about your motivation. We got to wrap it up pretty quick.
No, I just.
Oh yeah, he was.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, please, please. How's it all looking?
It's looking good.
Let me just take a quick look.
Matt, this is amazing for me. You
Oh,
know,
great.
I think it's great. Very little point. I know what a union man you are. Would you want Flint to do a little snippet that the November 3rd anti-Klan stuff was really wrapped around
That's
the union?
great. Yeah. In terms of the
That they were
textile.
organizing to it, yes. The
Oh,
Klan
yeah,
and
absolutely.
racism
Yeah,
was to
that's
divide the
a
workers.
great point.
Well, speaking of unions, I thought what you were going to say was, do you want me to slam the police union because they're such an adversary of
Yeah,
ours?
you're
So I had to adjust sometimes between questions,
Excellent.
but we're doing
Excellent.
okay.
This footage ought to be required for every lawsuit, shouldn't it? With the dialogue and it ought to be
Yeah.
the centerpiece of a course, but anyway.
The
Well, just to go back to pick up what Lou was talking about in terms of the trying to organize which mill it was.
Well, all these
Cone mills.
And the union.
Can you talk about how that was a labor fight, that Nelson and
Well, it was remarkable, and it was reflected in the voir dire that we did of the jurors during the trial to select the jury. That the questions they were asked, what were covered the spectrum from the labor organizing that many of the organization, the Workers' Viewpoint organization, which later became the Communist Workers' Party, was doing in the mills here in North Carolina, and also the anti-Klan work they were doing. So there was a labor aspect, a union aspect to the case, and there was a quote outside agitator part of the case because some of the organizers were from New York and other places originally. And there was a racial aspect, obviously, because it was an anti-Klan demonstration, and one of the major focuses of the Workers' Viewpoint organization at that time was taking on the Klan in a very aggressive way and confronting the Klan. And so in the voir dire, people were asked, the prospective jurors were asked about, their views about labor organizing, their views about agitators, outside agitators, which was like a common term in those days, about communists, of course, because they had that right in their name, and the anti-racist, white supremacist. And we got rid of over 300 jurors in their reactions to those four very interrelated and powerful aspects of the case. Also, there were just some remarkable events in the case. And Lewis Pitts and I had primary responsibility for cross-examining the Nazis and the Klan and the police and the FBI. And Carolyn McAllister had her primary responsibility was dealing with many of the plaintiffs and putting them on the stand and working with the damages and all of that. And one of the main Nazis came to court one day, and I was about to cross-examine him, and he had 5 white skulls on his lapel. He wore a suit to court, and of course there were 5 demonstrators murdered in Greensboro. And that was the kind of intimidation just in the court itself that went on, and of course the kinds of things that the cops had done in the Hampton case, that the Klan and Nazis had done in the Greensboro case, and that Burge and his people had done in the torture cases, just the violence and the racist violence that was perpetrated had to put you on notice that these people were capable of doing anything. They had done these unbelievable, in the sense of racist and white supremacist and police activities. So you would be a fool not to have a consciousness that this might happen again and that you need to be on guard against it.
Wow. 5 white skulls.
Yeah, that was a Friday afternoon. He came in he represented himself, as many of the Klan and Nazi guys did. He came in a 3-piece suit and white tennis shoes. He was about 6'5", as I remember, a big guy, probably 250, 300 pounds. Not particularly intelligent guy, just an overtly racist and anti-Semitic guy. And so that afternoon, we had quite a bit of ammunition on the Nazis and Klan in terms of their racism. And I think I was cross-examining Wood, had him recite a song, an anti-Semitic song, an anti-communist song. There was a song, I think, "Kill a Commie for Christ," and was going through all of this stuff. And at one particularly powerful point of exposing him, the jury laughed. And it was so upsetting to me at that point. I called for a recess because it just seemed so, cold but then I thought about it more and I realized, how people are when they're so uncomfortable. It's made so uncomfortable by something that they laugh. And I was hopeful that that this is why the jury was acting the way it was. But it was very deflating to hear the jury laugh at that. We took a break, and Paul Bermazon, who was one of the survivors of the attack by the Nazis, who'd been shot in the head, and at that point was in a wheelchair, and had just previously testified to Wood, because one of our approaches was to put on a plaintiff, a victim of the attack, and then put on one of the Klansmen or Nazis on the stand to show the contrast. And Bermazon was from a family of Holocaust survivors. And so he obviously set a tremendous contrast to Roland Wayne Wood, the Nazi, with the, singing the anti-Semitic and the anti-communist songs. So we went in the men's room in a break, and Bermazon's in there. He's going, "Man, if you keep it up, he's going to come down off the stand and attack you," he goes. And I kind of nervously laughed and said, "Yeah, I'm down here to fight this case, but I'm not sure I want that to happen." Then we went back out, and it's Friday afternoon, and I'm thinking, need to get in front of the jury, the white skulls, the white. And so I confronted him with it, and he denied that was what it stood for. But the point was made. I mean, obviously, that was what it was for, and there was no other reason for it. But there was drama like that in many of the examinations and many of the courtroom scenes in the Greensboro case.
Well, we should move towards wrap up. I just, in terms of your life doing this, I mean, you have a family. What was it like for your family to have you? I mean, the trauma of what you just described in terms of, not just in terms of your personal safety, but confronting evil, whether it's racism or anti-Semitism or or combinations. I mean, that's been what you've gone through as a person. That's been, I would assume, hard to. I mean, you absorb that. I mean, I do oral history and documentary stuff, and I did a documentary about hate crime, and I interviewed a gay guy who was almost beaten to death in L.A. by a serial killer of gay men. And, you know, I mean, doing those interviews, you obviously it kind of leaves something with you as the interviewer, you as the lawyer. How has it been for you? It's kind of a convoluted question, but personally, I'm just trying to get a sense of it for you personally, what this has all been like, this long journey of yours.
Well, you gain a lot of strength from the people you represent, from the organizations you represent. I mean, and the lawyers you work with, and over the years, I've been extremely fortunate in all those regards to have these remarkable clients, to work with very energizing movements, and to work with lawyers, including my lifelong friend and comrade Lewis Pitts here in Greensboro, who you stand shoulder to shoulder with in some of these fights, and so you get a lot of strength from that. And there are days and weeks you go back and you shake your head and wonder why you're doing it, but usually either because of that strength that you gain, because of the fire that you have to fight the injustice, doesn't go out as long as the injustice continues to be in your face. And in terms of family, I have a wonderful family. I didn't have my daughter until I was, she was born right in the middle of the start of the Wilson torture cases. So I went through the entire Hampton case without any children, and my wife was a lawyer, a people's lawyer as well. So I was young, and you know, and I wasn't, and that was my whole life. You know, I didn't really. That was the fight was the fight, and the fight was my life. And as I got older, then I had a family, and things. You know, to survive over these 50 years, you can't be in the fight 24 hours, 24/7. You never survive. So then I got strength from my family as well, but I think all of those things, and the other thing is that when you see what your clients have gone through, you haven't gone through that. You know, I mean, in this country they still don't shoot lawyers, do they? You know, it's unlike in Mexico where they murder journalists. They don't murder journalists yet in this country. I'm not saying that's not going to happen. Given the tide that we see happening here in this country is very frightening at this point. But there's a perspective in terms of the threats and the realities of your own personal safety versus maybe if you were in, someplace like Mexico, for example.
Or Turkey is a bad one too.
Yes, that's a bad example, a good example.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add from your amazing career and all that? It's
think of anything, Lewis?
Anything else, you guys?
No.
That's pretty mind-boggling.
Yeah, there's so much more he could say.
Oh, we can be here all day.
Yeah, but that'll just make it harder for you to find that 30 seconds you want to put in.
One thing to remember here, see, we're this project, Unsung Heroes of the Civil Rights Movement, is we're doing on video, but basically you call it oral history. We want to build an archive here of people like yourself and Lewis who've done important things, and we want to get the unsung heroes, even though I think they're, obviously you guys have been noticed in the media over the years, but I'll give you an example. We actually started this project about 5 years ago. An historian here at this campus named Chuck Bolton, who ran the Civil Rights Archives in Mississippi for a number of years, along with Curtis Austin, the gentleman I was referring to. And we started this about 5 years ago. We interviewed about 4 people down around Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and one of them was a white gentleman named Buford Posey, who was the first white person to belong to the NAACP in Mississippi in 1961. Okay. He'd been in heavy combat in World War II. He carried 3 guns on him at all times, so he was no pacifist. But he was the first person to learn about the murders of the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, because he was known, he was already working with Dr. King and all. anyway, so we interviewed him, and so that was the genesis for this project, which we're now getting going heavily to do these interviews, to build an archive. But of course, I'd like to do a documentary or two out of some of the better stories. So we may be going back to Chicago.
Well, there's one other thing I think let me throw in.
Yes,
now
please,
I'm
whatever you
sitting
want to
here.
do.
Are we still rolling?
Yeah.
In terms of the torture scandal, after the Wilson cases and the exposure that the Deep Badge gave to the fact that it was systemic, and that led to Burge's firing in the early 90s. At that point, the issue of people on death row who had been tortured became in the forefront. And we and others started to raise those issues in court and also in the public. And at the same time, there was in Illinois, and particularly in Chicago, a major fight going on about the death penalty. And so on Illinois death row, the men who had been tortured by Burge formed something called the Death Row 10. And they were men who were on death row as a result of tortured confessions. And they, from the inside, together with movement organizations on the outside and lawyers, raised these issues. And so the movement against the death penalty came together with the movement against torture through this Death Row 10 group and through the work, and led in the 1999 to a moratorium on the death penalty in Illinois. In 2003, it led to the commutation of all 163 men and women on death row, their death sentences being commuted to life, and the pardoning on the basis of innocence and the fact that they were tortured of 4 of those Death Row 10. And ultimately, that led many years later, in 2011, to the abolishment of the death penalty in Illinois. So the death penalty in Illinois is interrelated, and the movements against the death penalty in Illinois interrelated to the movement and the fight against police torture. And I think that's an important point, as well as the fact that we and others in the anti-torture movement took our case internationally. We took it to the Organization of American States, and we had a hearing in front of one of their committees. And then ultimately we took it to the UN in Geneva, to the Convention Against Torture, and presented it to them. And in that presentation, it convinced them to issue a report which connected Guantanamo Bay and the torture at Guantanamo Bay, the torture at Abu Ghraib, and the torture in Chicago, which was an important stepping stone for us in the early 2000s in fighting the cases. And we also very much fought the struggles politically in the city council, in the county board, and anywhere where we could get hearings. So there's a remarkable story that led to the reparations in 2015, which was kind of a culmination of all these different struggles that started out in the 80s, exposing police torture. And that's important to underscore.
Ryan, I'm just one allied question. In other words, working in terms of the media all these years, Chicago and across the country, in terms of publicizing these cases, like the torture. Of course, now this book will certainly bring this out.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. You know, there were some wonderful investigative reporters, including a man by the name of John Conroy, who wrote investigative article after investigative article in an alternative newspaper called the Chicago Reader. There were some journalists, mainstream journalists, that we ultimately got interested and followed it and gave honest presentations about it over the years. But it was a struggle, and it was an important struggle. The media was an important struggle in bringing first the Hampton case to public eye and the truth of that, and then of course the torture scandal. And I think when Burge died, now we're 30 years later, and when the media started out with Burge, it was, you know, decorated Vietnam veteran, commander of the police department, and here's Andrew Wilson, cop killer. I mean, that's the way the articles were written. Alleged police brutality, not torture, police brutality. Now, when Burge dies, front page, notorious torturer dies, you know, not only front page, but like a time, you know, one of those time things that show, you know, everything that's happened in the cases. And Daley's name is mentioned, that Daley as a figure in the torture. And of course, that was an important part of the book that I wrote, was to show what Daley did, didn't do, what he said, didn't say, how he, you know, turned as the wind blew in terms of how he approached it, and that's not really told. That part, we at least got into the public eye the fact that Daley was part of this, but not obviously to the degree that I'm telling it here. And when they did the post-mortems on Daley when he left office in 2011, it wasn't mentioned, you know, his role. Or if it was, you know, maybe I was quoted as saying something. But at least in this book, you can see what he did and didn't do. And I think historians and people who, history of the city of Chicago and history of politics in general, hopefully they'll look at this, you know, and they'll see that there's more to the Daley story than the parks that he created, or, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay, well, I think we done. How about a hand? Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you. Well, let me rid you of the